Margaret had been driving for 3 hours straight and her old station wagon was running on fumes when she finally pulled into the gas station just off Highway 52. The summer sun was beginning its descent and she could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders the way it always did when she'd been driving too long. Her daughter Emma sat in the passenger seat with her headphones on staring out the window in that distant way teenagers do when they're processing something they don't quite want to talk about yet. Margaret turned off the engine and sat there for just a moment gathering herself before she reached for her wallet. Money had been tight since the divorce and every gallon of gas felt like a calculation she had to make carefully. She stepped out of the car and the humid air wrapped around her like a blanket. The gas station was one of those older places that hadn't been updated in decades, with pump handles that stuck a little and a small convenience store that still had the original tile floor from probably the 70s. There were a few other vehicles scattered around the lot and Margaret noticed a group of young men standing near a beat-up truck about 20 feet away. They were loud in that particular way that made her instinctively uncomfortable and she could smell cigarette smoke drifting across the parking lot. She tried not to make eye contact as she slid her card into the pump and waited for it to process. The machine beeped and she lifted the nozzle beginning to pump gas while keeping her attention mostly on the numbers climbing on the display. That's when one of the young men called out to her. His voice had that edge to it that she'd learned to recognize over the years working retail and raising a daughter alone. The tone that said he was looking for some kind of reaction. She pretended not to hear him and kept her eyes on the pump. But he called out again, louder this time, and now his friends were laughing. Margaret felt her stomach tighten the way it always did when she sensed trouble coming. She glanced toward the car and saw Emma looking up now, her headphones pulled down around her neck and concern crossing her young face. The young man was walking toward her now and his friends were following behind him like a pack. He was maybe 22 or 23 with the kind of swagger that came from never having faced real consequences. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her car, then back at her with a smirk. He said something about her vehicle being a piece of junk and asked if she needed some help from a real man. His friends laughed again and Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady and told him politely that she was fine and didn't need any help. But he didn't leave. Instead he stepped closer and his tone shifted into something nastier. He made a comment about her appearance and then about Emma, and that's when Margaret felt fear spike through her chest. She looked around the gas station hoping to see an attendant or another customer, someone who might help, but the few other people there seemed to be deliberately looking away. The young man reached out as if to touch her arm and Margaret stepped back, bumping against her car. She told him firmly to leave her alone, but her voice was shaking now. That's when she heard it. The sound of motorcycles. At first it was distant, just a low rumble that could have been thunder, but then it grew louder and deeper until it seemed to vibrate through the air itself. Margaret watched as a group of motorcycles turned into the gas station parking lot one after another. They were big bikes, the kind that announced themselves with authority, and the riders wore leather vests with patches that marked them as part of a motorcycle club. There must have been 8 or 9 of them and they pulled in, forming a loose semicircle around the gas pumps. The young man who'd been harassing Margaret suddenly stopped talking. His friends had gone quiet too and they were all watching the bikers now with expressions that had shifted from cocky to uncertain. The lead biker turned off his engine and the sudden relative silence felt heavy. He was a big man, probably in his late 50s, with a gray beard and sunglasses that hid his eyes. He swung his leg off the bike with the ease of someone who'd been riding for decades and stood there for a moment just looking at the scene in front of him. Margaret wasn't sure what to expect. She'd heard stories about motorcycle clubs and not all of them were good. But then the big biker smiled, and it was the kind of smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made his whole face look kind. He walked over slowly, his boots heavy on the pavement, and nodded to Margaret. His voice when he spoke was gravelly but gentle. He asked if everything was all right here and said he'd noticed she seemed to be having some trouble. The young man who'd been harassing her stammered something about just talking and the biker turned his attention to him. He didn't raise his voice or make any threats. He simply asked in that same gentle tone if the young man's mother had taught him how to speak to women. There was a pause and then the biker said that his own mother had taught him that a real man protects women and children and treats everyone with respect. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather, but there was something in his presence that made it clear he meant every word. Behind him the other bikers had dismounted from their motorcycles and were standing in a casual line. They weren't doing anything threatening, just standing there, but their presence changed everything. One of them was a woman Margaret noticed with long gray hair pulled back in a braid. She smiled at Emma through the car window and gave her a little wave. The young man muttered something that might have been an apology and started backing away. His friends were already heading back to their truck, moving quickly now. Within moments they'd climbed in and the truck was pulling out of the gas station with a screech of tires. The tension drained out of the air so quickly that Margaret felt almost dizzy with relief. She realized she was shaking and she put a hand on her car to steady herself. The big biker turned back to her and asked again if she was okay. Margaret nodded but found she couldn't quite speak yet. The female biker walked over and introduced herself as Dorothy. She asked if Margaret wanted to sit down for a minute and get some water. There was something so motherly in her tone that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. She shook her head and managed to say thank you, that she was fine now. But Dorothy wasn't having it. She gently took Margaret's arm and guided her to sit on the curb while one of the other bikers, a man with kind eyes and gray temples, went into the convenience store and came back with a bottle of cold water. Margaret drank it gratefully and felt her hands stop shaking. Emma had gotten out of the car and was standing nearby looking wide-eyed at all the bikers. The big biker, whose name Margaret learned was Frank, crouched down so he was at eye level with Emma. He asked her name and when she told him, he said it was nice to meet her and that she'd been very brave. Emma blushed and said she hadn't done anything. Frank shook his head and said that staying calm in a scary situation takes courage and that her mother was lucky to have her. Dorothy was talking to Margaret now, asking where they were headed, and Margaret explained they were driving back home to Indiana after visiting her mother in Tennessee. Dorothy nodded and said that was a long drive to do alone. She asked if Margaret had enough gas money, and before Margaret could protest, Dorothy had pulled a $20 bill from her pocket and pressed it into Margaret's hand. She said it was just to help out, that they'd all been in tough spots before. Margaret tried to refuse, but Dorothy's expression made it clear the matter wasn't up for discussion. Frank finished pumping Margaret's gas for her and checked her tire pressure and oil level without being asked. Another biker, whose vest said his name was Jack, wiped down her windshield. They worked quickly and efficiently like a pit crew, and when they were done, Frank handed Margaret her receipt and said her car was all set. Margaret stood up feeling steadier now and looked at the group of bikers gathered around her. She didn't know what to say. These strangers had appeared out of nowhere like guardian angels on motorcycles and had chased away her tormentors and taken care of her and asked for nothing in return. She managed to thank them, her voice thick with emotion. Frank waved it off and said they were just looking out for folks. Dorothy gave both Margaret and Emma hugs, and several of the other bikers called out goodbyes and safe travels. As Margaret and Emma got back in the car and pulled out of the gas station, Margaret watched in her rearview mirror as the bikers mounted their motorcycles again. They were laughing about something and seemed to be deciding where to go next. They looked nothing like the threatening figures she might have imagined if someone had asked her about motorcycle clubs. They looked like ordinary people, grandparents and parents and folks who'd lived long enough to understand what mattered. Emma was quiet for a few miles and then she said she'd always been a little scared of bikers. Margaret glanced at her daughter and said she had been too sometimes. Emma asked why they'd helped and Margaret thought about it for a moment. She said she thought it was because some people understood what it meant to be vulnerable and alone, and those people tended to look out for others. She said kindness didn't always come from the places you expected. Emma nodded, slowly processing this. Then she said she wanted to be like that when she grew up. Someone who helped people who needed it even if they were strangers. Margaret reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand and said she thought Emma was already like that. As they drove on toward home with the sun setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret thought about the unexpected gift of that encounter. She thought about how frightened she'd been and how powerless she'd felt in those moments before the bikers arrived. And she thought about how Frank and Dorothy and the others had simply seen people who needed help and had provided it without hesitation or expectation of reward. It reminded her of something her own father used to say when she was young. He'd tell her that the measure of a person wasn't in what they said or how they looked, but in what they did when no one was watching. These bikers had stopped not for recognition or praise but because it was the right thing to do. In the weeks that followed, Margaret told the story many times. She told it to her mother and her coworkers and her friends. Each time she told it she saw the same reaction: surprise at first and then a kind of warm recognition. People liked hearing that there was still goodness in the world, that strangers would still look out for one another. One day about a month later, Margaret was at the grocery store and she saw an elderly man struggling to load heavy bags into his car. Without thinking, she walked over and offered to help. The man looked surprised but grateful, and as Margaret lifted the bags into his trunk she thought of Frank and Dorothy. She thought about how kindness ripples outward, how one act of decency can inspire another. When Emma got her driver's license a few years later, Margaret gave her the talk about being careful and watching her surroundings. But she also told her the story again about the bikers at the gas station. She told Emma that the world could be scary sometimes and there were people who would try to take advantage or cause harm. But there were also people like Frank and Dorothy who rode motorcycles and wore leather and had the biggest hearts you could imagine. She told Emma to be one of those people, to be someone who stopped when others needed help. Emma promised she would, and Margaret believed her. Years passed and Margaret thought about that day less frequently, but it never quite left her. It had become one of those formative moments that shaped how she saw the world. She found herself more willing to trust in the goodness of strangers, more ready to offer help when she saw someone struggling. She joined a volunteer group at her church and started spending Saturdays delivering meals to homebound seniors. It wasn't the same as what the bikers had done for her, but it felt connected somehow, like she was paying forward the kindness she'd received. One Saturday she delivered a meal to a woman named Helen who was in her 80s and mostly confined to a wheelchair. As Margaret was leaving, Helen mentioned that her grandson was part of a motorcycle club. Margaret's ears perked up and she asked which one. Helen named a club that Margaret didn't recognize, but when she described the patches, Margaret felt a jolt of recognition. It was the same club that Frank and Dorothy had belonged to. Helen said her grandson and his friends did charity rides for children's hospitals and women's shelters. She said people often judged them because of how they looked, but they were some of the kindest people she knew. Margaret smiled and told Helen she believed it. She shared her story from that day at the gas station and Helen listened with tears in her eyes. When Margaret finished, Helen said she wasn't surprised at all. She said her grandson had been taught from a young age that being tough meant protecting others, not hurting them. That real strength was in lifting people up. Margaret drove home that day thinking about the connections between people, how we're all linked in ways we don't always see. Those bikers had helped her once years ago and now here she was helping one of their mothers. The circle of kindness kept turning. Sometimes late at night when the house was quiet and Margaret couldn't sleep, she would think about what might have happened if the bikers hadn't shown up that day. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety even now. But then she would remember the sound of those motorcycles, the way they'd seemed to arrive exactly when she needed them most. And she would remember Frank's kind eyes and Dorothy's gentle hands and the way they'd made her feel safe and cared for. She would think about how the world was full of people who looked scary but had hearts of gold. And how we never really know who our angels might be until they arrive wearing leather and riding motorcycles and reminding us that kindness is everywhere if we're willing to see it. Margaret learned something that day at the gas station, something she carried with her for the rest of her life. She learned that help comes from unexpected places and that prejudging people based on appearance was foolish. She learned that community meant looking out for one another regardless of whether you knew each other's names. And she learned that small acts of kindness could have ripples far bigger than anyone imagined. Emma grew up and had children of her own, and Margaret told them the story too. She wanted them to know that the world had frightening moments, but it also had people like Frank and Dorothy. People who would stop everything to help a stranger in need. Her grandchildren listened with wide eyes and asked questions about the motorcycles and the bad men and whether Grandma had been really scared. Margaret answered honestly yes, she'd been scared, but help had come and that was what mattered. She told them to always be the ones who helped. To be like those bikers who'd seen someone in trouble and hadn't hesitated. The story became a family legend passed down and retold, and each time it was shared it carried with it the same message. That kindness matters, that people matter, that we're all in this together. And somewhere out on the highways, Frank and Dorothy and their friends continued to ride. They continued to stop at gas stations and diners and small towns. They continued to help people who needed it and to live by the code that their mothers had taught them so long ago. The code that said real strength was in protecting others and that being tough meant having a soft heart. Margaret never saw them again after that day, but she thought of them often. And in her own way she tried to live up to the example they'd set. She tried to be someone who stopped when others needed help. Someone who looked past appearances to see the person underneath. Someone who understood that we're all just doing our best and sometimes we need a hand. That day at the gas station had lasted maybe 20 minutes from start to finish. But its impact lasted a lifetime, shaping not just Margaret but Emma and eventually Emma's children too. A single act of kindness rippling outward like a stone thrown into still water. Creating waves that touched shores no one could have predicted. And that perhaps is the real magic of human kindness. Not that it solves every problem or erases every difficulty. But that it reminds us we're not alone, that someone cares, that the world still has good people in it. People who ride motorcycles and wear leather vests and stop to help strangers at gas stations simply because it's the right thing to do. People like Frank and Dorothy who appear when you need them most and then ride off into the sunset, leaving nothing behind but gratitude and hope and the knowledge that goodness still exists in this world if you're willing to see it.